So, first of all, can you hear? Is it loud enough?
Almost.
Almost. What's wrong with that? Good enough? Better? You're welcome. So today being the first Sunday of the month, we have an extended schedule for your benefit and the benefit of all beings, and also for our collective entertainment. Because we do better when we enjoy what we're doing. So there's no requirement for you to stay the whole day, but the schedule will include some teachings in the morning and practice from now until noon with some breaks for your comfort. And following the morning session, coming up to around noon, we will break for lunch, which I understand is a potluck affair, downstairs or outside. And following the lunch break at 1:30, we'll gather to have an open conversation about what we did this morning. So questions and clarification can occur at that time. And that'll take us to mid-afternoon, and then we'll have a final session. And close. So if you can stay the entire time, that will be most helpful and most complete. Our main teaching and practice this morning and this afternoon concerns the practice of Chenrezig. And for those of you who are not familiar with the practice of Chenrezig, we will modify things a bit this morning because it's important to have a relationship with the practice, to understand it, to enjoy it. So our first step for the morning is the short teaching and practice on refuge and bodhicitta. In our lives, we routinely rely upon a myriad of relationships with others, relationships with ourselves, And it is not uncommon that our reliance upon many of the relationships and many of the things that we count on for executing our daily affairs. It's not uncommon that these sources of refuge, if you will, turn out to not work so well. The car we relied upon breaks down. Our health deteriorates and we're unable to do what we thought we would be able to do. And occasionally, just to fool us, everything goes well. And then, and so on. You could, in fact, take the entire body of teachings and practices in Buddhism and condense it down to this one issue of what are you going to go for refuge in? And of course, we all want to ask the question, how do I know it will be better than what I already have? But that question, of course, is sort of like eating at different establishments. You can't actually know if the food is good without eating there. So in the same way, we have to test it. And testing it is not always so easy. We start with the easy one. The easy one is no harm done. You can turn your minds to refuge in the Buddha. And if it doesn't work, abandon him. Find another one. You can take refuge in your growing meditation practice and your intention to focus your energies on holding the benefit of others as primary. See how that works? Refuge in the Buddha is not entirely or even specifically refuge in the figure of the Buddha, that person who stands as the icon of the entire tradition. It's not really about refuge in that person so much as it is refuge in what that person discovered as an authentic, workable, reliable refuge. And just because it's so interesting, we are already, according to the teachings in this tradition, completely endowed with all of the wisdom, insight, potential for love and compassion, joy, equanimity. So since we're already completely endowed with all of the essential things, one might ask, why go for refuge? That would be a reasonable question. The best that I can think of is that we look at consistently. Once or twice doesn't really work. You have to do it kind of consistently. You look at those things that you now go for refuge in. Not one day. Your car will work for a day, almost for sure. Your spouse will love you for at least a day, so that's pretty good. But we all know if we've stepped beyond adolescence, these things are not reliable. And it is in that not reliable aspect that we end up suffering. And that ending up suffering is what the entire tradition is about. Fundamentally, because it's not necessary. And we have, as I just mentioned, all of the requirements to be free of that suffering. Fundamental to the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, which I think we could say encompasses pretty much all of the other traditions. Fundamentally, in Mahayana Buddhism, our freedom from suffering comes about not by virtue of focusing on ourselves being free of suffering, but on focusing on the benefit of others, that we might be able to direct our energies to them in such a way that they would become free of suffering. Doesn't that sound a bit like we missed something? Like, what about me? Personally, I'm prone to catchy phrases. And the one that I've been carrying for the last few weeks or months is the very clear truth that we cannot accomplish our benefit. We cannot accomplish our own benefit. We cannot free ourselves from our suffering. Fundamental to the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, and by extension the Vajrayana and various other schools, the entire plethora of practices and approaches all focus on encouraging us to put all of our energies on the benefit of others. we could add softly that we might be free ourselves of suffering, and that it comes by virtue of focusing on the benefit of others. Fortunately, you don't need to make a sacrifice. It's an easy test. You can try it for a while and inquire about how you're doing or what might make it go better. And along the way, I feel confident to say that if you work with it intensely for a while means, how many zeros after the days, months, years. But we can't wait months and years. So we need to kind of jump into it, both feet, 2 hands. We have nothing to lose. So when we say in the refuge prayer, until the summit of enlightenment is reached, what is the summit of enlightenment? How would I know if I reached it? Back to the beginning, we are each endowed with the awakened mind. But it's kind of like we're each endowed with, kind of like at birth, in a kind of crude way, we might say, each person was given a beautiful jewel. But since we took that jewel for granted, we tended to leave it around, kick it around. It got dirty. It didn't seem very precious. And so it lost its value to us. So now what we want to do is we want to discover the value of it. This awakened mind, which is utterly free, inherently free of suffering, inherently free of fear, inherently free of confusion, completely endowed with unbounded loving kindness, compassion, joy in our positive activities, and equanimity in relationship to all sentient beings. So when we say until the summit of enlightenment is reached, we mean until we have reached that state where we experience that. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. So in this little short walkthrough through the practice of refuge, in order to be effective, we imagine when we say all beings, we imagine in front of us extending to the very boundaries of space itself, all sentient beings. A sentient being, is anything with a mind. So it's kind of vague, though we might look at ourselves and think must include me, all sentient beings. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all sentient beings. We imagine in front of us, extending to the limits of space itself, this enormous crowd of beings. We say, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. True refuge is not attachment, nor is it aversion, nor is it our good health. Since we just said you cannot accomplish your own benefit by wishing for your own benefit. It comes through the relationship with all sentient beings. So we must be fearless. Very important, fearless. We must be fearless. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding. We all know what calm abiding is, the ability to relax. Relax the body and relax the mind, free of discursive thought, free of attachment and aversion, free of hope, free of fear. Calm abiding is the foundation of so many practices. Continuing, it says, I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering, and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. It's a laudable wish. We can all cheer that wish. But we may still be left with the question, what about me? All those beings who extend to the very limits of space, we are those beings. Not somebody else. We are indistinguishable from them in that we still harbor our hopes and fears, our prejudices, our preferences. So the goal here is to relax, rest the mind even when it's busy. Have you noticed that? The mind can be busy and you can still relax. You can still notice the mind which is busy without being busied by noticing. You can be undisturbed even when the content of the mind is disturbing. These are important aspects that if you practice for the duration of your life, you will revisit them over and over on a daily basis. We want to see our own inherently pure mind, but we're not seeing it, so we become disappointed. So I have to remind us now before we move on and turn our minds to refuge and then engage in the practice, that story of the Buddha walking through many towns and villages at his time was approached by another person who approached him and asked, "What is really the difference between you and me?" And the Buddha's answer was, "Nothing." Well, except for one thing. We are both inherently endowed with fully awakened mind. You do not see it, and I do. That is the sole difference. It's good to keep that story in mind for the next century, because it embodies such a clear example of what we're doing. We are not adding enlightenment to ourselves. It's already there. We are not bringing any necessary thing to our mind which is not already there. So our job is to become like the Buddha, to see the elements of awakened mind which we already are endowed with. We are currently blind, but it is not organic, so we can see by virtue of engaging in practices that help us see. So now at the beginning, maybe all of that is clear enough that we can understand why it is that we begin every practice by going for refuge to the Buddha. Who is the Buddha? You are completely endowed with all of the aspects of awakened mind. You are the Buddha. You don't see it. Kind of like you could be fully clothed and not see your clothing in a dark room, but you are still fully clothed. So too, we do not see that awakened mind, but it manifests every moment of our continuous experience in this life. We are already Chenrezig. We are already the Buddha. With some confidence that that is the case, we are ready to find out what that means. Confidence is critical. So normally we get that confidence by virtue of our connection with great beings, or by something we read that really turned our minds in a certain direction. So we begin this morning then by refuge in bodhicitta, and the bodhicitta aspect is the answer to, if I cannot accomplish my own benefit, then what do I do? And bodhicitta is the answer to that question. Let's recite the refuge prayer and the bodhicitta prayer 3 times together.
Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will now practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness.
Now, as we often do, we want to take a few minutes and practice shamatha. And it is common for us to use an object in order to rest our awareness upon something, like a coin or a stick or a stone or an image of the Buddha or any of a myriad of other things. But this morning, I wanted to turn our awareness in a slightly different direction, rather than an inanimate object. Let's see if we can take a step up. When you give rise to bodhicitta, and you think to yourself, I will treat the welfare of all beings as primary in my practice. I will focus on the benefit of others as the single most important thing. And when you do that, just for a moment even, you give rise to an experience. Right? You give rise to an experience. And if you're focusing on a specific being, a friend, a relative, someone who is ill, someone who is troubled, someone who has harmed you or saved you from harm, whatever the experience is in this moment, then the important thing is the experience. It doesn't really matter what the experience is. What's important in the practice of shamatha here is to bring your attention to the experience. And that experience then will become the object of your shamatha. It could be someone you dislike, but you're making an effort to hold their benefit as primary. We could say, that's the best. If you want to have an experience which is strong, and a strong experience is what is necessary, then you focus on something or some person for whom you have a bit of an aversion, and you give rise to this bodhicitta. I will hold that person's benefit as primary, above my own. And when you do that, you then turn your awareness to the experience and rest your awareness on that experience for as long as you can, without attachment, without feeding any aversion. Once your awareness is on the experience may change. Just follow the experience with your awareness. Rest your awareness on that experience. And just come back to it when you find that you've drifted. So just take a few minutes. will dedicate the merit from this. By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. So we'll take a break now, about 15 minutes. And if you could be especially diligent this morning in maintaining silence on the break, that'll be helpful. Get a what?
A person who is here for the first time.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
I'll do it silently. Camilla.
Very pleased to be here.
Okay, now quiet.